This film employs dramatic reenactments. All words spoken by actors are exact quotations drawn from the interviews, journals, and memoirs of those who fought. In the late autumn of 1950, the United States is bringing the first of its boys home from Korea. Meanwhile, the first of the 26,000 Canadians who will serve in Korea are preparing to go to war. Charlie Forbes, a Canadian combat veteran from the Second World War, goes home to bid farewell to his wife and baby daughter.
On the 11th of November, I arrived home on Belvedere Street in Quebec City, where I lived, with full gears. Steel helmet, pistol, and everything. Full pack, small pack, big pack, kid bag. My world. And my wife asked me, "Where are you going?" And she started to cry. I said, "In 25 minutes, a driver will come here, pick me up, and I'm coming back in 2 years." So we sat, we didn't eat. We looked at each other. I kissed my daughter, and I said, "I'll be back. I'll be back."
November 1950, the Canadians are halfway across the Pacific when word gets to them that China has entered the Korean War with an onslaught. Chinese troops poured over the Yalu River, China's border with Korea, and are methodically driving the U.S. and its allies down the Korean peninsula.
To the United States, 15 other United Nations have already sent 35,000 troops to Korea, and more are on the way.
As soon as they set foot in Korea, UN troops are marched off to face the oncoming Chinese army. The overall commander of United Nations troops is General Douglas MacArthur. He had assured Washington that China would never enter the war. Now he is under fire for recklessly endangering American lives and walking into a Chinese trap. MacArthur takes a more positive view.
We have reached up, sprung the red trap, and escaped. Skillful withdrawal has been accomplished with such speed that it has led to many comments from ignorant correspondents that our troops were in flight. Nothing is further from the truth. Our troops are in excellent spirit and good condition.
Washington finds General MacArthur's assessment hard to believe. A new ground forces commander is sent to Korea to take control of the situation. General Matthew Ridgway, an aggressive career military officer, takes a very different view of the predicament and condition of the American 8th Army.
The spirit of the 8th Army gives me deep concern. There's a definite air of nervousness, of gloomy foreboding, of uncertainty, of apprehension as to what the future holds. It's clear to me the men have lost some of their confidence.
As Chinese and North Korean armies drive US-led forces backwards out of North Korea, at the bottom of the peninsula, the 1st Canadians arrive at the South Korean port of Pusan. They sailed into this harbor aboard a US troop ship, the Private Joe Martinez. They are the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, known as the Princess Pats. John Bishop is there and wondering what he's gotten into.
I do remember when we came in here, much to my surprise as a 19-year-old boy, looking out the side of the ship and seeing bodies floating in the water. The Americans sent down a band that played as we got off the ship, but I don't think many of us heard it that well because we were looking around trying to establish a feeling of belonging to what we were going to see and live with for many months. We were not ideologically related to anything. We were not on a great crusade. And I think most of us, probably a very high percentage, it was a great Canadian adventure. Let's get on with it.
Canada's famed Princess Pats arrives at the great southern port of Busan. Lieutenant Colonel Stone leads his unit ashore to join the fighting men of many lands.
The Canadian commander, Colonel Jim Stone, a seasoned combat veteran, comes ashore to face a U.S. demand that the Princess Pats be sent to the front immediately. The Canadians are put on standby, while Stone goes off to confront the U.S. commander. He is not about to repeat disasters from previous wars when Green Canadians were rushed into battle.
The situation was very critical. They were not sure what was going to happen. And anybody they could get that would fight. And when you think of a lieutenant colonel saying, no way, I'm not going to sacrifice my battalion. I must have some time.
The Canadian colonel wins his point. Instead of heading for the front, the Canadians are taken to the mountains for 6 weeks of rough training. The geography of Korea reminds many Canadians of home.
The hills in Korea ran from the south to the north. They were not so high after all. And down the Gaspé coast where I was born, there were hills just about the size of Korea. 1,200 feet, 1,400 feet, 1,500 feet. I felt quite at home, to tell you the truth.
The battle in Korea is fought from hill to hill. For military advantage, armies have always competed to hold the high ground, to better see and attack the enemy. Up near the 38th parallel, the U.S. Army is being pushed off one hill after another as the Communists relentlessly drive south. The drive climaxes in a major new Chinese offensive on New Year's Eve, 1950. Chinese troops cross the 30th parallel, the border between North and South, attacking frontline positions manned by South Korean troops, breaking through and heading for Seoul.
The South Korean army has broken and begun to run. I've never had such an experience before, and I pray to God I never witness such a spectacle again.
The advancing Chinese army is under the command of General Peng Duhai, a veteran of the Chinese Civil War and a favorite of Chairman Mao.
我们第一次和李的部队接触是出乎意料的，我们歼灭了他们。我很理解毛泽东的指示，他们是把国际主义和爱国主义结合起来，用国际主义拯救朝鲜，用爱国主义保卫中国。
Now look at this. And look at it.
The early days of 1951, refugees stream away from the advancing Chinese army.
Miles and miles
A U.S. propaganda
and
film
miles
captures the moment.
of homeless refugees set adrift by the Red Skirt.
Those days are still vivid for Ed and Myung Cook. They married and made a life in Canada after the war, but now are revisiting their Korean homeland, where both their families feared the communists. At his fishing village of Malipo, Ed Cook is only 13 when his father shares a terrible secret.
I was oldest son, and he called me to a bedroom and showed me what he had. What he had was poison, and he put the poison into a small envelope wrapped up for each member of the family. So my father and mother and my younger brother and my sister and myself, 5 in the family. And he made 5 pouches, and he didn't tell anybody but to me. If we, whatever the reason, cannot escape, and if they are going to come to get us, we must give this to each member of the family. And last, you and I take and let's kill ourselves. That was a secret.
While Ed Cook's family is preparing for the worst, in Seoul, Myung Cook and her family are almost alone in their neighborhood. They pack up, but her mother won't leave. Myung's father was disappeared by the communists during the first occupation. Hoping he might reappear, her mother says, "Go ahead without me."
Mom wouldn't leave. She wanted to stay. She wanted to stay, and but we really had to really beg her to go, and so finally she had to give in and came with us.
At Incheon Harbor, where only 60 days earlier MacArthur's troops had arrived victorious, Myung's family is part of a human wave going in the other direction, in full retreat. Their vessel is a fishing boat, already loaded with 90 people. They become Korean boat people, a shipload of refugees with no sailing skills, about to face a December storm.
We were just sitting, squatting, and there was only one washroom for 100 people, and there no dining area, nothing, where they would put food through the hole. Then we would get the food and just one bowl of soup with rice in it, and then everybody was having motion sickness, so it was people were throwing up, and it was a mess.
Ed and Myung Cook and their families make it to safety, but millions of other South Koreans are trapped by the communist advance. The military situation is grim. The Canadians are finished their training and preparing to move into the fight. On the way, they encounter the remnants of a segregated regiment of U.S. black troops and learn a stark lesson.
We stopped in what you might call a slaughterhouse. We couldn't believe it, and to a young 19-year-old boy, it was, what am I getting into? And in actual fact, an all-black transport company decided to have a rest for the night. And the Chinese came in with a fighting patrol and killed them all, 65 to 85 people. Because they burned the village too, some of the people were cooked like they would be if they were cooked in a pot. It was a valuable lesson Colonel Jim Stone, and he was right, said, you guys are putting your sleeping bags away, and you're not going to have your sleeping bags, because most of these blacks were fighting their way out of their sleeping bags, which were covered with blood and ripped. And some got out of their sleeping bags and some didn't. And I guess that's why Colonel Stone made the decision.
The massacre is devastating for UN morale. But General Matthew Ridgway travels the front lines, bucking up his troops and reorganizing them as a fighting unit. He ends the UN retreat, marshaling all the firepower and skill of the US Army, and methodically begins to roll back the communist advances and march north.
We've come back as a fighting army, not a running mob. We've brought back our dead and wounded, and our guns, and our will to fight. We've picked ourselves up off the ground and waded back into the fight.
This is how the American military intends to win the war. A massive logistical movement of materiel to the front. The patient application of overwhelming force. When Charlie Forbes, a Second World War combat veteran with lots of experience, arrives in Korea, he is astonished at U.S. power.
I could see bombardment. I could see napalm burning, columns of black smoke. The impression that I got, and this was my first contact with the Korean War, if you saw a thing like that in Europe, you knew that it must have been a battle the size of a divisional or corps size, with concentration of artillery beyond your imagination.
Put some more fire down on those people.
So when I arrived at the American captain's position, we met. I said, what's going on? I've never seen so much fire. Oh, he said, it's like that all day. They're bombing the other side. But is there an attack that has been planned to follow up behind this fire? No. I was completely disarmed. I said, is this war in Korea? But the planes, the noise, the columns, the roads being built, the traffic, the convoys. When you talk to the Americans, you talk big.
The Canadians and other allies are equipped with American tanks and guns.
The Canadians were in awe, of course, of the firepower that they had. And everything we had was American. We ended up with American everything. I think on the whole, we were glad that we were fighting with them.
By April 1951, U.S. forces have rolled back the Chinese advance and are ready to once again cross the 38th parallel. This is a critical moment. President Harry Truman and the Allies now want to end the war with a negotiated settlement, settling for a boundary at the 38th parallel, which existed before the fighting started. General MacArthur resists, saying in war there is no substitute for victory. He wants to devastate China. Privately, MacArthur puts down the president to anyone who will listen.
He has never been to Korea, and his ignorance of the Far East and its peoples has become a dangerous liability. It is quite apparent that his nerves are at the breaking point. Not only his nerves, but what is far more important in a chief executive of a country at war, his nerve.
When MacArthur writes a letter to a congressman publicly challenging Truman's strategy to end the war, the president is furious. Truman writes in his diary, "This looks like the last straw, rank insubordination." I've come to the conclusion that our big general in the Far East must be recalled. For Truman, there is a clear constitutional issue at stake. Generals must be subordinate to elected leaders. At the White House, in the middle of the night, the president sends word to MacArthur he is fired.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
President Truman has relieved General MacArthur of command, and I've been appointed to replace him as Supreme Commander in the Far East. I do feel his dismissal could have been handled with more grace.
Moscow and Peking rejoiced. The bells were rung and a holiday atmosphere prevailed. The left-wingers everywhere exulted. But in the Far East, there was bewilderment and shock. I had become a symbol for the free world, a bulwark against the spread of communism. The removal of that symbol was not understood, intended to shake faith in our ways and methods.
MacArthur has achieved almost godlike status in Asia. His removal provides a lesson in democracy for the entire region. It appears, though, that his removal emboldens America's communist enemies. Just days after MacArthur's departure, the Chinese reject Truman's peace overture and launch a massive offensive. They stream over the 38th parallel, heading for Seoul. To stop the Chinese, the UN forces mass at a place called Kap Yong. John Bishop is back at the spot where he and 900 Canadian soldiers arrived and made camp, wondering what was happening.
We were rather suspicious because we couldn't figure out why we'd been brought up here, but I guess 8th Army must have had some word that something was going to happen.
The Canadians are in the path of the invading Chinese army. To stem the tide at Kap Yong, the Canadian battalion is teamed up with the Royal Australian Regiment. Both are supported by the guns of the New Zealand Artillery Regiment and the cannons of US tanks. Together, they are commanded to block the way.
The Chinese, of course, are in their massive attack across the entire front, are coming down every possible route, down river valleys, down roads.
The Chinese call it the 5th campaign, a gigantic offensive deploying 750,000 troops against 340,000 UN forces. It is one of the biggest battles ever fought. The Chinese strategy is to surround and kill, but never to attack fortified positions head on.
敌人的机械化部队运作迅速，建立防线很快，特别是他们用坦克作战时，以我们的技术装备去攻击敌人有攻势防御的阵地是不利的，甚至会失败。
John Bishop remembers the first wave coming at the Canadians were not Chinese soldiers.
The Chinese had overwhelmed the forward positions, and the refugees in the thousands were streaming down the north-south road towards Kap Yong.
From the beginning of the war, UN forces believe their lines are being infiltrated by Chinese and North Korean soldiers who supposedly hide in refugee columns. The result is a US policy some would call a war crime. These recently declassified US Army documents from January 1951, marked secret, show the orders to all United Nations units were clear. Stop all civilian traffic in any direction. Responsibility to place fire on them, to include bombing, rests with you. At Kap Yong, at 5:30 a.m. the 14th of April, 1951, just before the battle begins, the order to fire at refugee columns approaching Canadian lines is passed to Corporal Wayne Mitchell.
Down in the valley, there was a stream of refugees. Looked like hundreds of thousands. We were told that infiltrating among the refugees was the enemy. Orders were to stop them. It felt horrible. When I set up, I fired low.
This U.S. intelligence report following the battle complains the 8th Army directive that civilians be turned away from the front lines by artillery or small arms fire was difficult to carry out due to hesitancy on the part of younger soldiers to fire directly upon groups of old men, women, and children. Next at Kap Yong, 3 U.S. aircraft fly into the valley, strafing and bombing the civilians. Another American battle report notes, strafing fire from low-flying aircraft is very effective at clearing a road, but does have the disadvantage of creating animosity among the refugees. In the main battle at Kap Yong, the lead elements of 6,000 Chinese troops assault the Australian position. The Australians make a long fight of it, supported by tank fire from the Americans. Almost surrounded, the Australians are ordered to retreat. Withering fire covers their withdrawal.
We could see the riverbeds, and we could see the Australians withdrawing from their positions. We could see the tanks from 72nd U.S. Heavy Tank Battalion, and it was just as if we were watching theater. It was unbelievable. Plus, we could see the Chinese forces trying to envelop around, and they tried to cross the Kap Yong River about 2 kilometers south of here, and as they tried to cross the river, they were mowed down. And they looked like beetles from up on top of the hill as they fell and floated down the river.
The Canadians are now alone in the moonlight. Most modern armies are reluctant to attack at night. Not the Chinese. They favor night attacks, all the better to surprise, confuse, and overwhelm their enemy.
At about midnight, I'm awakened. And I hear one of the people in the section saying, "I hear enemy." And we heard them for a while, they disappeared. The next thing we heard was B Company on our right being attacked.
The 100 Canadians of B Company catch the full brunt of the attack.
First of all, you heard bugles. They still used bugle calls, and I guess that gave them direction. They also fired some tracer. It's just a question of firing and firing and getting ammunition from people that are not firing, and then you're down to your bayonets and throwing grenades.
We're good. They're all over our positions before we even know it. Quiet like mice. Those little rubber shoes of theirs. And then there's a whistle. And they get up with a shout, 10 feet from our positions, and come in. First wave is throwing its grenades, firing its weapons, then wave after wave trying to break it. Damn it.
Men remember the dust, the smell of sweat, and the fear. Soon Wayne Mitchell is the only one left in his section, alone, manning the 2-man Bren machine gun.
Suddenly they're all over me. I get hit in the back with a shovel or something. I had the Brent gun. I fell down, landed on my back, firing into them. Bodies are falling all over me. He's either fight or be buried there. I screamed for help, and Roy, my section leader, came running and firing. As he jumped in the trench with me, he ran out of ammo. So he took his rifle, spear-like, and pitched it, bayonet first, right into an attacking Chinese infantryman. After that, we grabbed a couple of our wounded and came back down the hill.
In the Kap Yong battle, while some UN regiments were broken, the Canadians held their ground, demonstrating tactics learned the hard way in the Second World War. In the aftermath, the battlefield is littered with the dead from both sides. One British regiment in the next valley suffers 90% casualties. At great cost, the UN holds the line. The massive Chinese Spring Offensive of 1951 fails.
我们包围了敌人，可是当夜不能歼灭他们。在春季战役中，我们的战争伤亡最高，敌人不肯放弃汉城。
The US government called Korea a police action, not really a war. The men who fought in that colossal battle see it differently.
The 8th U.S. Army, which we were part of, had 7,000 killed and wounded. And the Chinese had 70,000 killed and wounded. And without getting on too much on it, you have to go, except for Stalingrad, you have to go to World War I to find such large casualties. So if that doesn't make a war, I don't know what makes a war.
In the summer of 1951, as the fighting goes on, peace negotiations between the two sides commence. But neither side is ready to make a deal. One day, the communist side arrives at the talks with weapons,
in violation
and a
of
U.S.
red
newsreel
promises
makes
that
the
no
most of
armed
it.
personnel would be allowed in the true city. Spotting our cameramen, the communist troops try to hide themselves and their weapons in the bushes. But the incident is already imperishably recorded on newsreel film. The Red's company commander, trying to scare our cameramen away, reaches for his gun, an action you will now see frozen.
The U.S. replies by strafing the headquarters of the North Korean and Chinese delegation. The mistrust and maneuvering never stop. The talks will drag on for more than a year and a half as fighting goes on. A stalemate develops along the 38th parallel dividing the two Koreas. Two big armies stare across a no-man's land that begins on one Korean coast and stretches 240 kilometers to the other. The U.S. begins pounding the Chinese and North Korean lines with the greatest air and artillery barrage in history, a campaign celebrated in U.S. propaganda films.
The 1st Marine Air Wing pilots slammed their rockets right into those dug-in commies. First, the air burns in close support. Scorching the place with napalm.
I have seen napalm bombardment. Napalm. We used it en masse, in large groups. Sometimes it wasn't, they were not always Chinese soldiers, nor North Korean soldiers. Villagers, refugees. A napalm bomb weighs about, 2,000 pounds, which is made of about 200 pounds of dynamite, and the rest is liquid petrol. First of all, the bomb hits the ground. From under the plane, it comes, it bounces, explodes and spills the whole stuff around. And the temperature goes up to thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. Everything that's under there cooks. Tanks, the temperature in a tank with the hatch down. You fry in there. The Chinese didn't have that.
At the front is General Du Ping, in charge of morale for the Chinese army in Korea.
敌人的飞机昼夜不停地袭击我们，敌人的长距离大炮昼夜不停地轰炸我们，可想而知我们军队的疲劳程度。我们的军队差不多损失了一半，我们急需休整和补给。
To counter the constant bombardment, the Chinese army decides to dig down and deep. At the 30th parallel, a defense is constructed that they boast is an underground version of the Great Wall of China. When the American troops can't dislodge the Chinese with grenades, they bring in flamethrowers to attack the tunnels.
Fry them out, burn them out, cook them. We found them dug in 10 feet deep.
Thousands of Chinese troops are trapped in collapsed tunnels without food or water, but most find a way to survive. Military historian Bin Yu.
There are even description like people eating their toothpaste, drinking urine. That's very common actually. And to get out those tunnels was also difficult. And sometimes the openings, entrance were blown out. They had to dig themselves out. So there was very, very difficult.
In the North Korean capital of Pyongyang today, you can still see signs of the massive air campaign, which was directed at North Korea over 50 years ago. There are still scars from Allied bombing on the concrete abutments under bridges. The largest chapter of that air campaign is launched in August 1951. It is called Operation Strangle. The aim is to sunder the communist supply lines, to pound and starve them into submission. In 250 days, the Air Force and Navy pilots fly 90,000 missions. The weapons, high explosives, napalm, fragmentation bombs, and rockets. The targets, virtually anything that moves. They destroy locomotives and rail cars, smash rail beds, marshalling yards, bridges, and highways. Even Chinese propaganda films acknowledge that driving a truck for the Chinese army has become the most dangerous job in the Korean War.
Of course, most of them had to drive at nighttime, and most of them had to drive without the lights on. That means if you switch on lights, you expose yourself to those night bombers. The Americans always have night bombers cruise around this communication line, and it's very dangerous. The road was bombed many, many, many times. Every bridge of 20 meters long in Korea was bombed many times, and then repaired, and then bombed. And the Americans also dropped those mines or bombs that you can trigger the explosion or disable the tires. So it's very, very difficult for drivers.
More than 34,000 trucks are destroyed. And 1 out of every 5 Chinese Army truck drivers is killed in action, double the casualty rate for frontline troops. The air campaign is one of the most controversial aspects of the Korean War. Arguing the enemy could be hiding anywhere, the U.S. Air Force, in violation of the rules of war, targets Korean civilians, their homes, villages, towns, and cities. In North Korea today, The memory of the air campaign is still searing. At the Take Am Collective Farm, Chairman Pak Jae-hong remembers the U.S. planes. He says they came to bomb the village day in, day out. But one raid stands out.
처음에 이제 비행기 소리가 나고 그때 그러니까 B-29가 조그만 비행기들 여러 대 달고 나타났습니다. 그래서 일부 사람들은 그 방공호에도 들어가고 미청호 편산도 이랬는데 처음에 오더니 기청 사격, 기청 사격을 쫙 하고 그 다음에 돌아가면서 사람들이 그다음에 기청 사격하니까니 왜 와야 이렇게 뭐 이렇게 하는데 그다음에 폭탄을 떨고 시작했습니다. 폭탄 소리 광들 그래서 그저 그때 100호 중에서 한 70-78호가 그저 완전히 다 폐허되고 사람들은 그때 완전히 무리로 213명이나 죽었습니다.
In North Korea, propaganda films show an elaborate attempt to move the entire society underground. School children enter caves every day for their classes. There are underground stores, hospitals. Entire factories are constructed in the earth, and the supplies of war materiel, weapons, and ammunition continue to flow. Without trucks, the supplies are moved to the front line on the heads of farmers. Thousands of men and women carry A-frame packs on their backs. U.S. intelligence officer Donald Nichols.
What the enemy does after we knock out his roads, bridges, railroads, airfields, and tunnels is to place large human work teams with A-frames every so many miles from the Yalu to the frontline troops. The A-frame is their secret weapon.
The massive air campaign against North Korea may not halt the supply of weapons and ammunition to the front, but it is successful in stopping most food from reaching the communist troops. They are getting less than 40% of the sustenance needed for survival. As winter descends, for the Chinese army, all there is to eat is a handful of rice powder mixed with a handful of snow, day after day, night after night. The starvation diet causes almost half the soldiers to lose their night vision, dangerous for an army that fights only at night.
A large percentage of Chinese infantry actually couldn't see at night, so that was considerably reduced the capacities of the Chinese military in night time fighting.
Hungry soldiers begin to loot the Korean countryside, foraging desperately for food. This troubles General Duping.
这让我很不安。他们会说，我们来这里打仗，挨饿受冻，不都是为了朝鲜人民吗？吃他们一点，喝他们一点，又有什么不对？包围住敌人城市。
Half-blind, starving, astonishingly, the Chinese army, after 8 months of Operation Strangle, is still moving and finding new ways to strike at the heart of UN forces. For every soldier, there are certain moments in their war experience that leave an unforgettable mark. For the soldiers from so many lands who fought in Korea, one of those moments is Christmas Eve, 1951. It is a hard night to be so far from home.
Charlie, bring me my violin, please.
Captain Forbes and the Royal 22nd Regiment are on a ridge at the front line. Forbes remembers dreaming of Christmas back home in his Quebec mountain village.
To us French Canadians, we know it's going to be the Christmas tree, the sleighs, the jingling bells, and the people saluting themselves. A village, 4,000 people at the time in Matan, down the Gaspé. But it was the joie de vivre, eh? So we were lonely.
Word comes from headquarters to mark Christmas Eve in a memorable way.
Tonight at midnight, after respecting 1 hour of complete silence, at 12 o'clock for 15 minutes, we open up with everything we have. Feu de joie. It's fantastic. I said, here's what you're going to do. Grab some phosphorus bombs, the heavy type, not the light one, the 12-pounders. Change the fuse. Put a time fuse on it. And we're going to fire that so that it reaches about between 6,000 and 10,000 feet in the air. To blow up. We'll fire that as a salvo. That will be our part of the show.
Across no man's land, there is silence for 1 hour, and then a Christmas overture.
A massive explosion. Massive noise, deafening noise. As the fire was petering out, stand by, I yelled, salvo. Fire! There was a trail of burning powder and way up in the sky. Then a dull sort of explosion. And then it became suddenly white, like a white sheet on fire, alive, coming down like a curtain of fiery milk, up to about 100 feet above the Chinese position. Everybody applauded, you know. And Charlie Labonte arrived just about that moment with the coffee pot. You could smell the rum from Tokyo. Oh, my goodness. Oh, no, it was powerful stuff. They started the fire, and they all gathered around the fire. And everybody had their granite cups, and we saluted, Merry Christmas, and we drank together. I'll never forget that. Then everything went quiet. Then out, coming from the Chinese position, loudspeakers, very powerful. It started very soft, very mild. A tune, music, very low, amplifying itself gradually. The bass, the cellos, then full symphony. And it was a silent night. Just after this noise, this fire, soft, sweet, melodious music. It sort of took our tongues, our throat, our heart out of the body. We all looked at each other, we sat down, and we cried. The Chinese, they would use our own tool to send a soft thought in our heart. It shook all of us. It's subtle. It's so subtle. How to hurt you deeply without knocking your head over with a wrench, you know.
Korean War will go on for another Christmas, and more. Millions more shall die. And the United States will stand accused of secretly deploying a new weapon: biological warfare.